Joining us now, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin and staff writer for The Atlantic, Adam Serwer. All right, Lisa, I think the idea that any president can come along and issue an executive order on anything, and then only certain people will be able to maintain that right, while others are going to lose that right because of a ban on nationwide injunctions. That seems patchwork to me. It seems untenable to me. Part of the arguments we heard today from the other side of this, the AGs that are arguing this, was you can't have, one fundamental law apply to us here in New Jersey, have that person cross state lines and suddenly become not a citizen.
Right. It's administratively unworkable. And Jeremy Feigenbaum, who is the Solicitor General of New Jersey, is the one who made that argument. He also said that irrespective of whether it applies to people in New Jersey, let's imagine a situation in which a New Jersey woman, a woman who is undocumented, goes to Pennsylvania across the state lines to give birth. What happens then? He was basically saying, look, we administer a bunch of federal benefits here for which, even if we win and another state loses, if you have to be able to show that somebody coming into your state is in fact a citizen, how do we verify, for example, SNAP benefits, Medicaid, a whole framework of federal benefits that we administer here, who is eligible for them, who can register for them, how we administer them? All of that is in flux if we have no nationwide injunction.
Just the verification of whether the parents are citizens or here legally in this country on a case-by-case basis at every single hospital or birthing center or whatnot in this country. And there was a moment where Justice Kavanaugh really touched on that. He said, you're asking for new practices and new procedures to be put in place all across the country, and you're saying they have to do this in 30 days. How do you think that they're going to be able to do that? And Sauer said, well, that's not really up to me. It's not my issue. It's their issue.
Yeah, well, he was talking in that respect. He was talking about the administration, if this went into effect, if the executive order were allowed to be implemented anywhere in the country, that executive order gives the administration 30 days to decide how it's supposed to be implemented. So Kavanaugh was asking, can the federal government get its act together? But you're right to also say, what do states do in that situation? States who understand that this is coming their way, what do they do? The other thing that Justice Kavanaugh was really focused on is, why are we in this circumstance right now? The president has talked about radical leftist judges trying to interfere with his agenda. And Justice Kavanaugh sort of pushed back on that and said, we're in a situation where over the last few decades, we've seen a rise in congressional gridlock, and presidents want to get things done. Justice Kavanaugh would know. He was a White House staff secretary. He said presidents want to push things through. And I'm going to take it that presidents of both parties, people of good faith, are issuing more and more executive orders. And in other words, the rise in these nationwide injunctions is in direct response to the fact that we are seeing more government through executive order in the last couple of decades than we've ever seen before, not because we have some rise in a collective of judges who want to thwart a president of one party or another, Katie.
Adam, you write in The Atlantic, it's no accident that this is the case that they are choosing to fight on, take a stand on. Why?
I think that this case is fundamental to the Trump administration's worldview. They are an administration that believes that immigration is bad for the country, despite the fact that virtually everybody here is descended from an immigrant. And, they are revoking birthright citizenship is one way to limit or to engineer the demographics of the country to be more reflective of what they want them to be.
If they wanted to revoke birthright citizenship, and if they believe they have the numbers to support them on that, so they clearly believe that they're on the right side of immigration. They argue that they've been given a mandate by the voters. They've got Congress on their side. Why would they not try to change the Constitution through a congressional act?
Because they feel like, and I think with some confidence, that with 6 conservative Republican-appointed justices on the Supreme Court, they don't need an amendment to rewrite the Constitution. They can just have the justices do it. And let's be clear that revoking birthright citizenship would be rewriting the Constitution to the way that the Confederacy would have written it after the Civil War, instead of the people who were actually there, the men who preserved the Union, who wrote it to implement non-racial citizenship in the United States for the first time to say, no, actually, all men really are created equal. So this is really an assault on the foundations of multiracial democracy in the United States, the idea that anybody can be an American, anybody can be a citizen. And you saw the justices being very skeptical of that, more skeptical than they were about the issue of nationwide injunctions, which, for obvious reasons is a, fairly bipartisan issue. There are people on both sides of the aisle who have objections to that. But it doesn't really solve the problem of when you have a president who makes a direct assault on the fundamental rights in the Constitution, what the courts are supposed to do about it. And Sauer complained that, there have been like 40 of these injunctions. Well, I think it's correct that one of the reasons we're having all these injunctions is because the president has to act unilaterally because Congress is paralyzed. But the other reason is that this particular president has been trying to rip out pieces of the Constitution that the conservative movement doesn't like. And as a result, he's running into resistance in the courts, not just from Democratic appointed justices, but from justices he's appointed. And so I could see the argument for narrowing the context in which you can make a nationwide injunction. But to say we're going to get rid of them entirely just enables a president who doesn't think that the Constitution constrains him to do whatever he wants.
And I feel like I didn't hear that from the New Jersey Solicitor General, saying that there can be a route to narrow it. It doesn't have to be. Was I wrong to hear that?
No, I think what the New Jersey Attorney General was saying was, look, I see nationwide injunctions as sometimes problematic, too.
Yeah.
And they should be used sparely. And there are certain circumstances that demand a nationwide injunction because it is impossible to get complete relief without one. This is one of those situations. But Adam is completely right to say that there were justices of both sides of the ideological spectrum today who expressed their hesitation about the usability of nationwide injunctions, Justice Kagan being one of them, but also sort of putting the Serwer argument into effect, saying, what would you have us do with something as flagrantly as unlawful as this is without one?
I know Laura didn't have a sense of where this is going. Do you have a sense of where this is going? Did you get a better idea from the questioning today?
I think Laura's takeaway that it's not clear if there are 5 votes for allowing the administration to do what it wants to do here is absolutely the right one. Who is going to come out on the other side of leaving things be and how they're going to get there is still unknown to me. But I saw some pushback from unlikely folks today. I saw some pushback from Justice Barrett, from Justice Kavanaugh, even from Justice Alito, who was essentially saying, if the plaintiffs can get almost everything they have now by suing with states on their sides and through class actions, why are you even here? That's basically essentially what Justice Kagan said at another point in the argument. When you have Justices Kagan and Alito both asking the government, what exactly do you want here and why should we give it to you? That's a sign that maybe the government's not going to prevail.
Lisa Rubin, you're sticking around. Adam Serwer, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.